And one of the things that we want people to understand is I really can't love someone well if I'm not grounded in who I am. I really can't experience intimacy well if I'm not grounded in who I am, or using our language, if I'm not in my own hoop, I can't really function in a relationship with someone else in a very healthy, functioning way.
Mhm.
Well, we want to welcome you to this session of the Faithful and True podcast. As you can see, for those of you that are regular listeners, that Randy is unable to be with us today. So I'm going to be filling in for him and just introducing the topic and also introducing our guest. And so Deb Laaser is here with us today, and we are very glad that she is here. She's the co-founder of Faithful and True, and she's also the author of two books. One of them is Shattered Vows, which she wrote a couple of years ago, and then a brand new book, From Trauma to Transformation, is out and was released this summer. So, Deb, I am glad that you are. There's no we. I guess I am glad that you are here.
Yeah, thank
So,
you.
welcome.
Well, thank you. We always have good talks about all these topics, don't we?
We do. It's kind of like we're just sitting in your living
I
room,
know.
and Mark is watching TV, and you and I
Yeah,
are having a conversation to the
yeah. We've
side.
done a
So,
lot of that, haven't we, over the years?
we have. And today, our topic is going to be on, if it comes from the concept of the three hoops. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time describing that, but we also want to make a reference to a previous podcast that we've done on the three hoops. But we also want to be very practical. You know, one of the questions that we get is, what does it sound like for me to address a topic or an issue with my spouse or with someone else and be grounded in my hoop? So, welcome. And so, Deb, why don't we just start with a brief introduction to the hoops, and then maybe even where this topic came from for you and why you think it's important for us to address it.
Yeah. Well, the three hoops is a demonstration that we use here at Faithful and True regularly to describe how couples develop over time. It really could be a description of any relationship over time, however, to describe what ends up being a healthy relationship and when do we start getting into unhealthy relationships with unhealthy communication. This really was birthed out of a book that came out many years ago in the 1980s, I believe, by Bader and Pearson, called "The Myth of the Mythical." I'm sorry, Myth of the Oh, I've forgotten the title of it. I have to remember. In Search of the Mythical Mate. I believe I have it right. In Search of the Mythical Mate. It's a great book of looking at how, as individuals, we've done a lot of research and looking at how we grow up through time. We go through different stages from infancy all the way up to our adulthood. And in those stages, we also do various developmental skills in order to move from one stage to the next. This book also describes then not only that concept, but how that relates to a relationship developing over time. And so we took that and with some information from another workshop we were in, we adapted that to be the three hoops. One hoop representing a wife, one representing a husband, and the other representing a coupleship.
Right.
And,
And one thing that I was so kind of intrigued by when I first heard the idea of the three hoops was this idea of couples development or relational development. That there is a process that we go through, and I think for a lot of couples, they may have some sort of shame in the way that their coupleship has developed. But the reality, there's a typical way, and it takes time, and there's this process. And so there's something very validating to hear that the way that you're doing coupleship is something that people have explored and researched and understand. And there's something very validating about that.
Mhm. I think you're right. And, that old movie concept that you just find your magical mate and then you live happily ever after is really not a truth for probably the majority of couples. And the truth is that to develop a really healthy relationship takes work at times and help from others, because if we all knew how to do that so well, we would have a lot more healthy relationships probably in our life.
Hmm.
I think for us, though, too, early on in in our recovery journey, we began to see where we were stuck in the relationship development. And it wasn't because we were bad people, or, we were dumb, or we didn't ask for enough help. It's just we didn't know differently about what else was available to move us along. So that's why we're so excited about showing this model to people, introducing them to what it's like and what we need to learn along the way in order to move to different stages.
Well, and when people get into difficulty in their relationship, there's typically a situation where people are not in their own hoop. That's kind of
Mhm.
where the language comes from, that they've left their hoop, they've left their sense of self, they've left their truth, and either they're outside of their hoop in some sort of coping strategy, so they're not present with themselves, or they have fully invested in the couple's hoop. And it's that sense of enmeshment or codependency where I'm not really grounded in who I am, but I'm over invested either in my partner or in the coupleship itself. And I do think we have this romanticized idea that when I find the right person, I will give myself completely to the relationship and I will lose myself in that. And intimacy, love, affection, commitment are actually exiting myself and giving myself to something else. And one of the things that we want people to understand is I really can't love someone well if I'm not grounded in who I am. I really can't experience intimacy well if I'm not grounded in who I am, or using our language, if I'm not in my own hoop, I can't really function in a relationship with someone else in a very healthy, functioning way.
Mhm. So it's truth that when we're young, we have our parents and other adults, influencers in our life who kind of come into our hoop to help us know how to deal with life, how to share our feelings for those that believe that's important, how to talk about things, ask for needs, and show us really what it's like eventually to be an adult who can do all of those things by yourself.
Hmm.
So, what we believe is that as we become adults ourselves, then we take over the responsibility of our own hoop. And so, what that means is that if I'm not liking my life, or I'm really angry about something, or I'm not fulfilling my own passion and purpose in life, or somebody is making me miserable, but I'm not doing anything about it, all those things are really now my responsibility as an adult to do something about. And I
Right.
think that's where we get into some of our struggles, I think, with our couples in relationship, is that they too often want the other person to change or do life differently so that they can be happier, more joyful, more fulfilled, more whatever. We know that's not the solution. Changing another person is not necessarily what is going to make my life beautiful and happy and safe. So we're learning as we go along, and part of our development is differentiating or figuring out how
Hmm.
to be my own adult, to be a standalone person, actually, if I have to be, so that when I enter into a relationship, it's not a need based relationship, but a choice. I choose you because I want to be here, not because you give me something or provide for me something that I wouldn't be able to be a standalone person without.
You know what? I remember the first time I was introduced to this idea of the differentiated self. I might have been in
Mhm.
college, I'm not sure. But I remember just being intrigued that healthy development is becoming a differentiated self, and healthy parenting is supporting children to become a differentiated self. And what we see is a lot of the chaos that's created in relationships is because there wasn't a differentiated self that entered into the relationship. So maybe there's a pattern of parenting where I look for my spouse to parent me, or I look to parent my spouse, or there's that enmeshment piece where my value, my identity, my safety comes from the relationship and this other person's reactions or responses to me. But I love what you're saying about I'm grounded in myself so that I know that I can be okay. And what's interesting is for some people, they may see that language or that terminology as being selfish. So what is the difference between being a selfish person who really um, is isolated or separated from somebody else, and a differentiated self that has the capacity to enter into a healthy, non-selfish relationship?
Mhm. Well, I think selfishness would lead one to not necessarily care about the needs or concerns of another person, probably lack empathy, or even a desire or encouragement of the other person and helping them to become the best person they can become. I think it's why really we can't learn necessarily all the relationship skills we're going to need until we get into a relationship,
Hmm.
because we don't really know what it's like to not have all time be my time and I get to choose everything I want for myself. When we're living alone, a lot of that becoming a standalone person can turn into almost too much of an independence or selfishness, in that you lose focus of what other people could use from you at times. When we focus on self care, however, I believe in our standalone being okay as an adult on our own, we're capable of putting some things on hold for ourselves while we enter in relationship and care about others. And that's a lovely place to be, because we're not doing it as a worn out person, as a resentful person. We're doing it because we want to do that. And
Right.
that is seen and felt more as a real loving relationship, rather than some of the other motivations that might lead you into being in relationship with another person.
And I think that's so helpful to understand that for the standalone person, they are motivated by desire. For the enmeshed person, they are motivated by obligation or
Mhm.
fear. And there's a very different energy. I often say that one of the ways that you can know that you are motivated by obligation is ultimately it leads to resentment.
Mhm.
Maybe not initially, but in some point, if I'm doing something because I have to, I'm going to start resenting the fact that I'm doing it. And so there, that awareness that says, okay, why am I moving towards this? And there's a difference between servanthood and actually enmeshment or placating, because in a servanthood place, I want to serve the desires of my spouse or my partner or my children, whoever it may be. But for that person, that survivor that's placating, it's I'm giving, but I'm giving for the purpose of getting. And again, for the person receiving that, it has a very different energy.
Mhm. It really does, and that kind of leads us to what is it like to be in our hoop and healthily serve, or healthily take care of ourselves, without it becoming, we often say, like a parenting relationship.
Hmm.
Many of our marriages, I think, have this parenting part of it, where one person is more or less taking charge of what's best for the relationship, what's best for the other person, or managing things for another person that they don't do very well themselves. Now, that could be looked at as servanthood, I suppose. And yet, when we continue to do things for other adults, that they would be better off learning some of that themselves to be able to take care of themselves if they need to. In some ways, we limit their growth. And
Hmm.
we don't necessarily want to do that. However, part of being married is that we're stronger together than we are individually, and I believe that's a truth as well.
So let's take some circumstances that we come up with, that we hear, that maybe we've even lived, and
Mhm.
talk about what does it look like to address these issues from my own hoop.
Mhm.
So let's say that some of our listeners are aware that their spouse, and this could either be the husband or the wife, has certain coping strategies that they perceive are not helpful. Maybe somebody's watching too much TV. Maybe somebody's overinvested in sports. Maybe somebody is spending too much money. Maybe someone's concerned about how much someone is eating or drinking. So I'm observing someone doing that. I don't want to get into the parent role. What might be some of the ways that I can move towards that issue as a partner and not as a
Mhm.
parent?
Why don't we have some fun with being a parent, first of all?
Okay.
And let's talk about what it would sound like if we were in our hoop talking to our spouse's hoop. I think it's good to just kind of imagine. I've been watching The Voice lately, and on the rounds where they're both singing, and I forget what they call those, the battle rounds. They both
Yeah.
are in their own little ring, and then they're singing back and forth. Well, imagine that's how we're talking to each other. So if I'm looking over at someone's hoop, my spouse's hoop, and I'm deciding that they're watching too much TV, as a parent, I might throw some of these kind of words over there like, you're watching too much TV. It's not good for you. You need to stop that. There's so many other more meaningful things to do. I'm really getting frustrated with that. I really think you need to change. Okay, that
Hmm.
would be a parenting. We do that all the time to our children, try to teach them things. We try to explain, we sort of mini sermonize stuff to them. And when we start doing that to our spouse, I think there's a part of them that feels like a little kid. And it does make you angry because I think all of us want to be an adult in our adult relationships. And
Hmm.
when we hear people giving us advice or directing us to how we're supposed to live, it does conjure up a lot of frustration and anger in relationships, I believe. What would your
Well, I
parents
think
sound like?
I think what I also hear is I'm trying to convince you and use logic to do that. So the parent might be, you need to go outside and play. It's a great day. It's pretty.
Mhm,
You need to run around and get some exercise. You've been sitting in front of the TV too long. And if you don't go outside and play, I'm going to start taking things away from you. I'm going
mhm,
to limit your access to the TV. I'm not going to let you have that special dessert. So I'm going to start giving you some motivation based upon some things I'm going to take away from you if you don't do what I think is best for you.
mhm. So threats could become another part of unhealthy communication between these two hoops, then,
Mm.
where you need to do what I say, or else I'm going to threaten to do something else if you don't. Right.
Well, one thing about the parenting role is anytime I'm using power, I'm more in the power parent role than in the partner role.
Hmm.
So threats typically have something to do with power. I'm either going to do something to you or I'm going to withhold something from you. And so that's, I think, part of what we respond to as an adult is if someone is trying to leverage their power against me, that's not going to land in me as if we're partners in this, but they're trying to parent me into something.
Mhm. And I would say, Greg, that because of our clientele and working with couples where there's been unfaithfulness, I want to be careful to not say that, or to say that sometimes we have a need to actually take action, which is different than a threat, which is
Hmm.
usually it's a threat. It's words without action that follows, oftentimes.
Right. Well, and there's a difference between a threat and a consequence.
Mhm.
And so to be able to say, because of the choices that you're making, there's a part of me that feels unsafe. And I need, instead of saying you need to do this, I need this. And then here's going to be the consequence, or here's how I'm going to draw the boundary. And I often say to the men that I work with, if the boundary doesn't have consequences, then it's just a suggestion.
Mhm.
And so to recognize if my spouse, in a case of our clientele, the guy is a sex addict and he is making choices that aren't safe for the wife, then it makes perfect sense that instead of trying to parent her husband into some sort of recovery, she simply recognizes the boundaries that she needs to create for herself and what she's going to do in order to create that safety.
Mhm. So maybe we could take that as an example, Greg, of a wife that would like to see her husband engaged in more of a recovery plan, maybe doing involved in more counseling in a group, let's say, or reading more, taking time in his own spiritual journey, and she's not seeing much of that. So, an example other than criticizing him, which again would be like throwing bombs into the other hoop. Criticizing comes from that place of not being healthy in terms of how we're communicating that, blaming him, really demeaning him by or shaming him by saying, you're never going to get it because you're not doing enough work. And so it's almost like attacking his character in that way. Some of the ways we want to teach you how to talk from your hoop in a healthy way would be maybe, first of all, talking about what you're feeling. When you're sharing from your own hoop, you are going to be better known to the other person than not. And if you're going to be known when you're communicating with another person, you're going to have to be using a lot of eye language and talking a lot about, first of all, maybe what you're feeling. I'm
Hmm.
really worried when I see that you're not so engaged in recovery, but you used to be. I'm really worried and concerned that maybe you're losing momentum to stay on that really great path that you were on before. That would be a start for how we might be noticing what's going on in another person's life, is simply talking about what I'm feeling in that situation.
Well, and another thing, we often talk about the idea of perspective, that in our conversations with our spouse, one of the things that helps us stay grounded in our hoop is, instead of making these, what I refer to as God Almighty statements, you're not doing anything, or, I don't feel like you're taking care of yourself. To really just add that word perspective. From my hoop, where I'm standing, my perspective is that you're not as invested in recovery as you once were. Or
Mhm.
from my perspective, you seem to be kind of oppositional to some of the resources that people have recommended. So that I am owning it as my perspective. And one of the things about perspective is, I might be right, I might be wrong, but I'm not declaring that this is the way that it is. I'm just saying, this is what I'm observing, this is what I'm
Mhm.
experiencing.
So I think this is one of the most important things we can practice in terms of being in our own hoop, is claiming our own thoughts about things. Some of the language we like to use around here is the story in my head. And
Hmm.
that's just kind of a nice way of saying, this is what my head is thinking about this situation. I'm thinking that if you don't do enough of this work in recovery, most likely you'll slip back and you won't be able to stay faithful to me or to yourself. That's the story in my head. Now, that may not be a truth, as you said. For a lot of men, maybe they're able to do it that way. That isn't our reality here. However, the story in one's head, or their perspective, or I know I used to hear you say a lot, my judgment is, all those are ownership words. I believe, I think, in my opinion. If we get used to using that language that really claims our words coming from me, and it doesn't mean you have to believe the same way I do, it can go a long way to extending a conversation safely. I just
Well, and
love that, especially in politics. If we could learn to do more of that in politics, I see you doing that. In my opinion, it would be better done this way. you know,
right.
we
Well,
could get along perhaps a lot better if we just owned our own stories and let someone else
absolutely.
own their own. Mhm.
Well, and there's a completely different energy about an observation versus an accusation.
Right.
And maybe we don't intend it. Maybe we want it to be an observation. This is what we're seeing, or this is what we're perceiving. But the energy that we're bringing into it is more of an accusation. Instead of an observation, I have a concern because my sense is you're not, going to your group as faithfully. Then it can easily become an accusation of, you are not going to your group as much as you once were.
Mhm.
And so, even how we're presenting it, and one of the ways that we can know we're grounded in our own hoop is we're operating out of truth. We often encourage the men to identify what's true about you, what's true about the situation, what's true about God. The truth is what helps us get into that wise man or that wise woman place. And that's one of the ways that we can know that we're in our own hoop.
Mhm.
And so these conversations are going to go much better if I'm not in that enmeshed place in the relationship, and I'm not outside of my own hoop in some sort of coping strategy. And
Mhm.
so if I can be grounded in my truth and speak my perspective from my truth, it does come across as safer, I believe.
Mhm. So, just to give our audience an example of how that would come across with this example we're using, a truth might be shared that I know what's true is you've worked really hard to be a different person. And another truth is I've really appreciated that this is what you desire, and it is your vision for yourself and a relationship to do that. So, I just want you to know I believe that you can do things that you set your mind to. Just seeing the change lately has led to that worry. So
Mhm.
those would be truths, and it's very nice for people to hear truths because they're generally very positive most of the time. And so we all open ourselves up more to listen more carefully when we have some positive things that are being told to us also about who we are.
Well,
Another.
and even like a general truth, and a general truth is, in order for a person to recover from an addiction or a coping strategy, it does take intentionality and effort.
Mhm,
It does take an investment of time, and so that's just kind of a general truth. And so it doesn't even necessarily have to be about the person. It can be in general. It could be more specific of, one of the things that I'm aware of is your life has gotten busy. There have been some additional expectations at work, or there's been a lot going on with our family. That is true.
mhm,
And I also can own that my anxiety gets triggered when I see you canceling appointments, or I don't hear you talking about the appointments that you're going to, or the groups that you're attending.
right. So again, you mentioned earlier, truth could be about yourself, about the other person, about the situation, about God. A
Mhm.
truth for maybe a wife saying that is the truth is, I get anxious about a lot of things. And what could be true is this is one of those situations where my anxiety is ramping up, and maybe there isn't a particular need for that to happen. So that could be a truth as well. And so you
Mhm.
begin to see, audience, as we're talking to you, that it could be about the person talking, it could be about the other person, it could be about the situation. So those are just examples of naming some truths.
Well, and even from the husband's perspective, he may be able to validate, what is true is because of what I've done and the choices that I made historically, your anxiety makes sense.
Mhm,
And it does make sense that you would want to see me invested and committed to what is going on. And what we would want is for the husband to be able to own what is true about his own level of commitment,
mhm,
to be able to say, what is true is I haven't been as committed to my group, or what's true is earlier in recovery, I was reading books or listening to podcasts more regularly, and I'm aware that I've taken a step back from that.
mhm,
So the more that we can validate someone else's perspective and truth and not do it in a defensive way, then it's going to help us, because what's true is and again, we're going to use our circumstance with the wife, the spouse, and then the husband who is an addict. But the husband has the commitment of responding from his hoop also. We're not just talking about a wife moving towards her husband out of her hoop, but the husband needs to be grounded in his own truth as he responds and owning what's true about him, what's true about the situation, what's true about his recovery, what's true about his commitment. Because the more that he can own that truth, the more he's going to be grounded in his own hoop. And defensiveness is one of the ways that we get outside of our hoop.
mhm. So I like what you're saying, Greg, is that ownership or admitting that we do something that's not so helpful in a situation is a great way to create safety for this conversation. Probably, one of the biggest ways that we can change the dynamics of of a conversation that's really gone badly to getting it back on track is thinking about what you can own or admit to get it back on track.
Mhm.
So that's not always easy for people to do. A lot of times that has not been modeled to you in your growing up family, which is interesting to me in that we're a Christian counseling center. And one would think that owning something, taking the plank out of your own eye, so to speak, would be a very important thing that we practice in our families. But when you think about it for yourself, as we're talking to you, the audience, it's a question to ask, how well do I do that? Do I admit when I'm cranky? Do I admit when I was overly angry and said some things that were very hurtful? Do I admit that I shut down and don't say anything when I get angry or sad? What do I do that makes our relationship difficult at times? And that is a very good thing to get ownership from, so the other person can really hear that you are doing some of this self-assessment, and you're not just assuming that they are always the wrong, they are always the problem with the situation. Our ownership helps us to equalize our relationship.
Absolutely. Well, I often say ownership is what creates safety.
Mhm.
And one of the things about ownership is that it is vulnerable. So when our spouse does own something, it's we may be tempted to jump on it and kind of pounce on it and end up with a see, I told you so, or I knew I was right. But ultimately that's not going to serve the coupleship. So
Mhm.
when our spouse does have the courage to own something, then we can just affirm them for that and receive that. And,
Mhm.
one of the things for the person who is maybe reacting, to be able to say, what may be true is I don't have all the information here, and my perspective is you're not going to group as much as you once were. And maybe there is some information that's missing. Maybe the group is on a break, or maybe the leader is changing, or maybe the husband has determined that that group isn't helpful and he's looking for another group. So again, if there is additional information that can be shared from our hoop, which means we're not defensive, we're not outside of our hoop, and I'm sharing it not to placate my spouse, not to kind of get her off my back, but if there is some additional information that the spouse may not have, I can share that from my own hoop and do it in a safe way.
Mhm. So another way we talk from our hoop is to really know what we need in a situation. And I think that's interesting when I talk with wives about this particular concept, how many of them don't know what they need. They know they've had an emotional reaction, or they know they're afraid of something, or they're angry about something. And they have a difficult time figuring out what they need. And that's going to be a really important part of becoming an emotionally healthy adult. Our emotions lead us often to know what we need. For instance, the wife who is concerned that her husband is not as engaged in recovery might just say, one of the things that would be helpful to me is if I knew what your plan was, or I don't want to control it for you. I don't want to be overly involved. It's just really nice to know what you're learning, and maybe you're learning in a different way. My need is maybe just to be more engaged in your life, and possibly you in mine, so that we know how we're changing.
Mhm.
Knowing what we need is going to be so important, and being able to articulate that with another person. I think, again, when we're building a healthy relationship with one another, our desire would be that we want to try to meet the needs of our spouse if we can. It's not going to be possible all the time. Sometimes we can't, sometimes we won't. But if we can, and we're working on really becoming a united, healthy relationship couple, we do want to serve each other that way. And it certainly helps if the other person will state what some of their needs are, so we know exactly how we can be helpful.
Right.
We hear people talk all the time. Well, we've been married so long, they should just know what I need. I shouldn't have to ask for it. We're not good mind readers, and that really isn't part of the deal when we were born. So, our recommendation is get good at talking about it.
And my encouragement is also, and go to the deeper need. Many times what happens is, let's use our circumstance. Maybe the wife would say, I need for you to go to your meetings.
Mhm.
Well, that seems like the need, but actually the need may be deeper. The need may be safety.
Mhm.
The need may be to be included. The need may be to be chosen. And attending meetings is one of the ways to express that. And for those listeners who are familiar with Faithful and True, you're going to be familiar with the Seven Desires. It's the book that Mark and Deb have written. For those of you that are brand new to Faithful and True, I would absolutely encourage you to Google the Seven Desires and get the book, because it gives you a whole new way and a new language of talking about these deeper needs. Because a lot of times we'll stop by identifying a circumstance that we think that would be helpful, But the reality, it's actually more freeing and clarifying to get to the deeper need that the circumstance may actually represent.
Mhm. And the book, as long as you brought that up, is a reminder of a lot of the things we're talking about here in terms of when you think about the layers of the iceberg, so to speak, that are described in that book. They are all about how we stay in our hoop and talk about things in a healthy and safe way with other people. What I love is that this is not just something to do with a spouse. This is something to practice with everybody, with your kids, your
Mm-hmm.
employers, your neighbors, your good friends. Learning how to be a healthy, safe person when you're trying to share your thoughts and your needs and your feelings with others is such a wonderful way to grow closer to people. In a perfect world, I think we would like to think we could talk about anything with one another and not be judged, not be criticized, not be put down, not be powered over by someone else who
Mm-hmm.
has a different idea. That starts creating an incredibly close relationship. And so that's what we long for all of our clients to grow in those ways. The reason I brought this topic up today was because of a number of women in the women's workshop. Once we introduce this exercise of the three hoops, I think many of them go to this place. Well, if I'm not going to parent my spouse, then I need to say nothing. And,
Right.
my response to that is no, we don't want you to say nothing. We just want you to learn how to talk about what's important to you.
Absolutely. I just want to do a quick example for the men who might be listening. So let's say that my perception is my wife's anger has become destructive, and her anger is valid. I have betrayed her, I have hurt her significantly, and so her anger and the expression of her anger is actually something that is good. And maybe as a husband, what I become aware of is the way that she's expressing her anger is not helpful. So, what does it sound like for a husband to be in his hoop, to be able to address this issue of what he sees as destructive anger from his wife?
Mhm. So I get to answer that one, Greg?
Yes.
Okay.
Sometimes I think it's helpful for women to hear from women
Yes,
about
that's true.
these particular issues. And I can also be helpful
Yeah.
too.
Well, I think in a case like this, where it's probably a little bit of a sticky wicket, as we say around here, it's a topic that could go awry pretty quickly. It's really helpful to start with some truths first.
Mhm.
Truths might be, I just want you to know I've done some horrible things, and it's totally understandable why you would be angry and mad at me and scared, or any and all of those feelings. It's also a truth that I want to try to change my ways with you, and I want to be a faithful husband, and I long to choose you in the way you deserve to be chosen. I'm also aware that when you're angry at times, it really scares me, and it frightens me so much that I can start doing some of my old things that I do to avoid that, which is I can placate you. I can start just doing whatever I have to do to try to get you out of that angry place, which I don't think is a healthy thing, obviously, in our relationship. I also just shut down and don't talk at all. And I know that
Mhm.
even probably makes you angrier, so that's not helpful. But the story in my head is that it's really hard to stay present with somebody who is at that heightened level of anger, and I it's hard to listen to that. I know all I want to do is protect myself. It doesn't lead me to try to hear and understand you well. um, and I also believe that that's not the kind of marriage I hope for us, that we can talk about things and have our feelings, but they wouldn't get so out of control like I feel them. My real
And
oh, go ahead.
okay, so here's maybe a
Mhm,
complicated sticky wicket place
mhm,
is what if the husband's perspective is because of what I've done, my perspective is you believe that you have every right to hurt me in your anger. And
mhm,
I may be wrong about that, but it's my sense is there's an intentionality in your anger to hurt me.
mhm.
How do we navigate that? Is it do we just talk about the behavior, or do we can we say our perspective is something about motive?
Yeah. Well, remember, one of the things we teach about talking in a healthy way from our hoop is to check out our perceptions.
Oh, I love
And
that.
so he might at that point just say, I just wanted to check out something with you. Because sometimes I feel like your anger is more about revenge or wanting to get back at me. And it isn't just that pure, understandable, righteous anger that you
Hmm.
have for what I've done with you. Am I right about that? So checking out a perception is just naming what we believe the story is about and then asking them if it's true and giving them an opportunity to respond to that.
I love that. And
Mhm.
there is what's interesting is there is an intimacy that is created in that invitation and that desire to check it out. I'm not
Mhm.
assuming, I'm not making a judgment. I'm owning my perspective, and I'm also inviting you to speak into that. And maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but instead of just leaving it at an assumption,
Right.
I'm wanting to engage
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
conversation.
I think if people would learn how to check out their perceptions from their hoop, their life would change dramatically. I mean, about everything. I just had
Hmm.
someone who was going to come and stay with me tomorrow night. And it turns out my son, who is in my house right now, has COVID. And she said, I think I'm not going to come and stay. Now, that could for some people create some offense, like, oh, you don't really care about me, you're going to let that get in the way. But she actually followed it up with something she thought I might be thinking and saying, I just want you to know it's not about not wanting to stay. I'm just really afraid of getting the virus again, which totally I understood right from the get go. But her saying that
Absolutely.
was just, also another way of her making sure that I understood why she was doing what she was doing and not making up my own perception that was incorrect. Okay.
That's
We,
great.
we also need your husband to talk about a need that he has, right? And so the
Right.
need might be that I'm willing to try to talk with you about any of your emotions, anything you need. I do have a desire that it is a level that I can take in and hear. If it gets too much for me, I would like to take a time out and for each of us to take some time either connecting with others or talking about the situation until we can bring that down and then we can try again. And so I plan to do that and I hope if I'm in that place where you feel my anger is too big, that you'll call a timeout as well, because it doesn't help me to try to have conversations and to hear you well when we're at that level of anger with each other.
Another truth might be, the husband might say, what's true is your anger may not be disproportionate. And because of my history and my story and anger in my
Mhm.
childhood, either the absence or the presence of it, I don't know what to do with your anger. So, what may be true is I'm having an overreaction. And what's true is that's where I am. And I'm going to
Mhm.
be working on that myself.
Mhm.
The need might be for safety. And so, in my house growing up, anger never felt safe. And so I'm bringing some of that history into our relationship, and I'm committed to figure that out. So this can be about us. It doesn't just have to be about my history and what's getting triggered for me.
Right. It may be too that a need is just when we get to a place where you're that angry about something you want to talk to me about, that we do that with help, which is, I think, a good thing all of us can learn is when we aren't quite ready to handle certain circumstances and conversations by ourselves. Because we go to some very unsafe places when we do that, in terms of how we talk, when we talk, and what we relay to another person we love. We can hurt them terribly by things we say that are very difficult to forget. So, much better to stop perhaps and recognize I have a need for that to be addressed in a counseling session or with a pastor or someplace else where we have a third party to help us keep it safer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Deb, it's been great having this conversation about conversations. And
Yeah.
our hope is that this is something that has been practical and meaningful, especially for those of you that are familiar with the three hoops and are trying to do their best to have these types of conversations with the people in their lives from their own hoop.
Mhm.
As we mentioned at the top of the podcast, there are podcasts about the three hoops. And so you can look for those in our website where we have recorded and the old podcasts are available. So it's been great being with you, and we encourage you to check out all of the resources at Faithful and True at faithfulandtrue.com. And we look forward to being with you the next time we're together for a podcast.